Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Kris. Oh, I don't feel all that great right now. I just feel like blah, but it is what it is. So this is part 5, and we'll take this to. Um, it's going to be 2 parts left. Is there only 2 parts left? I don't even remember. We'll take this one. Probably should go to like 132. That'd be 18, and the last one would be 20. Just trying to figure out my spacings and all that stuff. So all right. Sorry, I got my cup right in the way. So before I get started, if you could click the thumbs up button, that helps out tremendously. You can subscribe to the channel, and you can donate to the channel through the thanks button. If you do, you get the title of sponsoring a video. This video is sponsored by Mohammed. So you'll get that same little shout out. You can still request without the donation. You just don't get that shout out. I just say this video was requested. All right, let's get into this video. It's been a good series so far. I hope that I'll feel good as it goes on, and I'll contribute.
So that's why they understood that freeing people was a good thing. That's why there's fadl in it. You get a reward for freeing people. But they also understood that it wasn't the most, they believed it was not the most important thing. So if someone was like too old or too sick or too incompetent to handle themselves, it was actually wrong to free them because they were going to be worse off if they were freed. So if we are in a position in world history where slavery is not needed economically, if we're in a position where we can remove the harm of itq from people, then the best way to fulfill this maqsid, this aim of the Sharia, of emancipation, is simply to do a categorical emancipation and get rid of the institution as a whole. Jazakumullahu khair. And
when he was talking about the old, so I always got a flashback to what I know. George Washington, he, I almost said did a good thing, but he did do a good thing to this. With his slaves, okay, yawn. Okay, with his slaves, he refused to break up the families, and so he would not sell a member of a family. You had to. There was one that kept running away, and he sold them to basically like the sugar islands. I don't even remember. Santo Domingo. I don't remember. He sold them there, and basically they figure, because they have no written record, but they figure that guy died in about 4 months because they just worked you nonstop. It was easy to bring in fresh slaves and just work them to death, and you just kept the products rolling out. So he said that was the only one that he ever did that to, and that was because that guy just wouldn't listen. He refused to not run away, so he punished him, basically sold him to death. With him not splitting up the families, the eventual outcome of that is, I gotta yawn again. Excuse me. The eventual outcome is that some of his slaves weren't having children, especially the women, because their children were born into slavery. And they didn't want that. So some of them stopped having children. Some did, in hopes that their babies would be free. And I get that. But near the end of his life, after his presidency, he started having, let's say he had 150 slaves. 75 to 80 of them were of the age where they couldn't really work. And so he was basically paying for them to live there and do odd end things if they could, but he was feeding them and they weren't doing anything. So he was losing money at that. It was a long day. So he was losing money. Then he had, let's say, 150, so minus 75 is 75. So let's just say that. So of the remaining 75, you probably had 40 that were of age and could work. Then you had the remaining 35 that were kids. So his workforce at one time was big, but near the end of his life, because he didn't sell those slaves, he couldn't work them. He couldn't work the kids. So he had a very small workforce. And that was costing him because he was having to rent slaves from other places to harvest his crop, and he might not even make his money back. So near the end of his life, he was really struggling. Now I say that as a guy who in today's money would have been worth about $553-ish million. So Washington was not struggling. In fact, he came across in 1797, after his presidency ended, he came across starting to really get into distilling whiskey. And he became the largest whiskey distiller in the colonies, or in the American states. He became one of the biggest. Made a ton of money off of that. But that was kind of a saving grace for him at the end. Sorry.
I can't believe I actually finished this, and I'll try and answer your questions afterwards, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khair. Inshallah, after Salat al-Isha, we will have around 15-20 minutes for Q&A. And I've already gotten a number of questions, but feel free to continue to send them in. Can you, Anzir, can you figure out how to send them in with the written paper? And also, I know the number of people have asked, they're interested in Dr. Brown's personal story as well, of how he came from converting to Islam to becoming, without praising him too much, but the fact of the matter is he is one of the most famous professors of Islamic studies in the world today. And this is a very honorable, he's in Georgetown's Islamic studies professor, and it's definitely a very interesting story from where to where. So a little bit about that as well after Salat al-Isha. But we have 5 minutes, so I'm going to ask you one question before Salat al-Isha. And that is, you glossed over this issue of concubinage. And obviously this is a very sensitive issue. So in 4.5 minutes, if you're able to answer, how do we explain to especially our young men and women, and outside the faith is obviously different, but our young men, how do we rationalize the concept of milk yamin? Because there is consummation, and what if she doesn't want it? What if? I mean, how do we, so what do you say, what are your thoughts about this from within the paradigm?
Okay. I never do this, but I'm going to not answer the question. I mean, there's a whole chapter in it in my book, and that issue you don't talk about without, serious mental preparation. I mean, what I mean is that in the book I was able to, I think, do a very good and thorough job of discussing it. What I'll say, what I will talk about is one aspect, which is that, and this also comes up in, people talk about the notion of like marital rape in Islam, and how there's no consent for, legally there's no notion of consent for sex within marriage and things like that. And I think this is an instance where we have to understand how other legal traditions work, and not just get obsessed with the language and concepts that we use in American law, especially modern American law and modern American society. So we in modern United States think about consent as the sort of sine qua non of morally acceptable relationship, right? So consent is what makes something okay. The lack of consent makes it not okay. It makes it not okay morally, it makes it not okay legally. This is fairly unusual in world history, especially the fact that This is basically the only moral tool we use in American society. Consent is of some importance in most legal and moral systems, but it's usually not the only thing. For example, if somebody wants to be in a relationship which is horribly destructive for them and their family doesn't like it, in a lot of places in the world, what they want doesn't really matter. The family is going to say, no, you can't be in this relationship, right? So we don't have that in modern American culture. We don't accept that, right? It's the person's consent, their desire that makes something right or wrong. So I think the first thing to understand is that we make the concept of consent do a lot of moral and legal work that it's really not up for. And if you're interested in this, I can suggest an excellent book by Joseph Fischel, professor from Yale, and it's called Screw Consent. That's what the book's called. It's a very interesting, excellent book of political theory and philosophy. I recommend the book. It's not very long. Now, consent is important in Islamic law. A woman who is baligh, right, she cannot be married off in general without her consent, right? But it's not, everybody doesn't have the same kind of power to consent. Your kind of consent is sort of based on the amount of importance of that consent is based on your social standing. But the reason why this sort of differed and had a sliding scale is because consent wasn't really how Muslim jurists and ethicists understood right and wrong in relationships. They understood it through the language of harm, darar, right? So if you're a wife and you go to and I have actually collected cases, and they're in my book, cases where women go to a judge and say, I can't get into the details, but let's just say it's a good read. You'll enjoy it. You won't put it down, at least not for that section, okay? They go to judge and they say, certain things are happening and it's causing me harm. And the judge, the husband has a right to do those things. In theory, the woman, because she's married to him, has no capacity to consent. But the judge says, you can't do this anymore. Because the harm is what makes something right or wrong. So what the work that we do in modern America through the concept of consent, Muslim ethics and Muslim law did through the concept of harm. And you could not harm your slave. I mean, you could discipline your slave in the same way that you could discipline your child, but you couldn't, if you were to go and beat your slave severely in a way that left marks or made a lot of blood flow, then we have instances in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and in Islamic history, throughout Islamic history, that the judge would force you to free the slave or to sell the slave. Right?
Inshallah, we will continue after Salat al-Isha, inshallah ta'ala, so please stay for that. Jazakumullah khair.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Why don't you take this one?
I see.
I'm going to reread it.
Okay.
So the first question is that we have been told that some of our Muslim or Arab brothers were involved in the American slave trade. Is this correct in your research, and is this valid Islamically, and did they justify it, what they were doing, the Arab slave traders?
Okay, yeah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So I'm not a specialist in the Atlantic slave trade, but I can, from what I do know, there, people buying and selling at both ends, so to speak, right? So most of the slaves who are, I don't want to say most, because I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I'll say a large portion of the slaves who are transported from West Africa to the Americas. Remember, most of the slaves went to Brazil. There's actually a really good graphic you can see.
Brazil got up to 5 million slaves, while the United States got 250,000, I think. Maybe 275. But I mean, 5 million slaves went to Brazil. That's just wow.
On this, for I think from like the African American History Museum, or I think one of the slavery databases, they actually have like a chart of all the ships, and you can see the majority of them actually go to Brazil. So they're basically being supplied by people who are raiding for slaves in various parts of West Africa. And those people were, some of them were Muslim, some of them were not Muslim. But what's interesting is that, and if you want to read about this, you can read Bilal or Rudolf Ware. He's Muslim, the name is Bilal. His book, The Walking Quran, he talks a lot about this. That in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, there's a state that's created in what's now essentially Senegambia, a place called Futa-Tora, which arises because these two ulama, see Muslims being enslaved, and they can't accept that. So they basically start a kind of a political movement, military political movement, and create a state in order to make sure that no Muslims are sold into slavery to the Europeans. And they, in fact, strike treaties with the French that no French slave ships are going to come up the Senegal River. And eventually, the Europeans basically give support to other states, and they defeat this state. But the Imamate of Fututora. The other thing is that I know at least one scholar in West Africa. I think one of the scholars from the lineage of Mukhtar al-Kinti, a great kind of West African scholarly tradition. He prohibited selling any slave if you thought that that slave might get then sold to a European. So I don't know about, yes, Muslims were involved for sure, but there was also a lot of Muslims, especially Muslim scholars, who were really committed to preventing any Muslims being sold into that transatlantic slave commerce or whatever, slave trade.
So we have another question here. I'm going to combine two questions. You said, do not trust your gut. How do we understand this in the light of the fitrah, and also in light of the hadith, البر ما اطمأنت إليه النفس والإثم ما حاك في صدرك ولو أفتاك الناس وأفتوك. Both of these things do have a gut. So how do we say, don't trust your gut versus this?
Someone like, Rahimahullah Ibn Taymiyyah would talk about the notion of al-aql al-salim, or so it's not that human beings can't have a kind of correct moral sense, but that we need to be very aware that we need to be able to kind of read our moral senses through an awareness of our culture, right? So let's say, I'm American. If someone says something about democracy, I'm going to be like, democracy. If someone says something about tyranny or monarchy, I'm going to say tyranny, monarchy, right? So we kind of have this, we're cultured into a view that democracy is good, tyranny / monarchy is bad. So you just have to be aware, I think, of how what your biases are. If you know that you have a temper, if you know that you have an ego, if you know that you have a hard time letting go of money or things like that, I think you have to be aware of what your own failings are, what your own biases are, and then you can. It's at that point, like your sense of your kind of moral intuition becomes more toned, more tuned, more finely tuned. So I don't mean to say that your gut is useless. I just mean to say that you need to always be aware that your gut is also a creation of your circumstances.
Do you mind if I add to that? It's awkward being.
You can add as much as you want.
As you're probably aware, the third chapter of my dissertation is about the fitrah, the concept of the fitrah, Ibn Taymiyyah. So just to add to that, Ibn Taymiyyah mentions that the fitrah can be corrupted. And when the fitrah is corrupted, then you will feel the incorrect fitrah telling you something that is incorrect. So hence this notion of gut instinct is not necessarily right or wrong. So the point is, as Ibn Taymiyyah mentions, the fitrah needs a check and balance mechanism. Who's going to check which fitrah is valid or not? So he gave the example of eating something that one culture finds disgusting versus another culture finds not disgusting. The culture that doesn't find it disgusting, the culture that has taken it as the norm, how will they know that it is wrong? Because their gut instinct is going to say that it's fine. So even the fitrah, it needs a checks and balances. It needs a higher source to tell it. Once the fitrah is in line with the higher source, now the gut instinct does kick in, right? So if you have iman and taqwa, then yes, you follow your gut instinct. But if you don't really have iman and taqwa, or you don't have, your fitrah is not in sync with the Quran and Sunnah, it's been corrupted, then you cannot rely just on your fitrah for morality. So that was, sorry to
No,
add
great.
to that, inshallah. Okay.
We have an expert on the subject with us.
We have a question here. Is warfare the only basis for enslavement? Is the only way to get a slave is to fight war?
So I should have mentioned this. I meant to and I forgot. Which is so probably, and it's hard to know because Islamic civilization is very big over a long period of time, but probably most of the slaves who come into Islamic civilization are not captured in warfare, they're bought. So you go to the slave market in Samarkand or Gench, and there's like a Viking guy there who's got like 300 Russian peasants, and he says, like, here's 300 Russian peasant slaves for you. So that's like the majority are just.
Okay, sorry about that. The puppy was out of the room, and I don't trust that puppy as far as I could shoot him out of a cannon. He just gets into things. He's too young. All right.
Purchased from outside. So if someone's already a slave, you can purchase them. So that's probably how most people entered Islamic civilization as slaves, especially from the Central Asia, Russian area, which is, by the way, probably the majority of slaves in Islamic civilization are from that area. The issue comes with whether the warfare that allows enslavement is like sanctioned by the imam versus just raiding. Because a lot of it is just raiding, and there's actually ikhtilaf amongst the ulama about whether that's allowed or not. And what happens in the 19th century, when a lot of this is interesting, like we would expect that kind of slave trade in the Muslim world, especially like Africa and Indian Ocean world, is like kind of decreasing, and then it gets rid of it. That's actually not the case. Its peak in terms of numbers is in the 1800s and 1900s. Like in the early 20th century, the Red Sea is just teeming with slave trade. So probably more so than earlier. So a lot of Muslim scholars start getting really concerned about the slave trade in the late 19th century and the early 20th century for two reasons. One, because a lot of Muslims are being enslaved. People going to Hajj from Baluchistan or from Southeast Asia or West Africa were being enslaved. Like Al-Kalbani, Imam Al-Kalbani. His family, his ancestors were Muslim scholars who were going to Hajj and were enslaved.
I didn't know that.
You can't enslave Muslims. This is unacceptable, right? This is completely unacceptable in the Sharia. So one of the things that they start to talk about, like Muhammad Bayram al-Khamis, who dies in 1889, Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi dies in 1902, then Muhammad Abdul Rashid Rida, stuff they talk about is actually, they're saying that a lot of these, the raiding has become unacceptable. Like these, they kind of take the position that only a sanctioned warfare by the imam can create prisoners that you can enslave, and you can't just go raiding into the Sahara because a lot of times they're enslaving Muslims.
So can I ask a very blunt question? Is it true to say that, especially towards later Islamic times, most Muslim societies did not live up to the Islamic norms of slavery in terms of acquiring?
That's hard to say. I don't know. I don't know if it'd be hard to make that generalization. I'd say that there's certainly, by the late 19th century, it's certainly become a big enough problem that it was like spoiling a system, right? I mean, it was problematic enough that when people like Muhammad Bayram al-Khamis or Ahmed Bey, the governor of Tunis in 1846, when they said that there's too many people being acquired illegally that we basically have to end slavery, I don't think they were making that up. I think that was like a genuine concern of theirs. It become a genuine concern.
Okay. We have a question here that you talked about the fact that Islam is very encouraging to free slaves. what do we say to the argument that since Islam is universal, and since the Prophet ﷺ is the seal of prophets, and since Islam came with so many other difficult things, why didn't Islam abolish instead of merely encourage? Why didn't it do that?
I mean, that's an excellent question. The answer is that it would be like, I mean, essentially it would be like saying we're going to abolish, transportation. I mean, it wouldn't, or we're going to abolish working or walking. It wouldn't make sense for people. And I want to repeat this. Nobody thought abolition wasn't some kind of idea that a few enlightened souls were arguing for. Nobody was arguing for that. No one conceptualized the idea of abolition. Even slaves who were engaged in slave rebellions like Spartacus weren't thinking about abolishing slavery, even in their own area, let alone like globally. It would be like, just imagine a world where in order to move anything, you need a person or an animal to do that. And then just imagine saying you can no longer use people or animals to move things. I mean, it just wouldn't make sense to people. So just imagine the impact that the use of fossil fuels has had on the human race. What kind of things that we are able to do with ease today. Like, we live lives where the weather means nothing. I mean, we live lives where I can literally go to London and come back in the same day. I mean, this is this kind of thing is inconceivable to pre-modern minds. So if the Quran talked about abolition, it would be like us talking about, I mean, I don't even know, like dimensional transport or something. I guess we do talk about that, but like, it would be like talking about like interdimensional transport in like 1800. It wouldn't make any sense.
So
I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. Ran a little bit longer. Oh well. So we will be back with the sixth and final part. I don't really have anything to add much to that one. But yeah, trying to explain fossil fuels and all that stuff to people 200 years ago. Just try to imagine explaining to someone that coal will power your house. And they're going to look at you and say, whale oil? No, not whale oil. Coal. There's going to be a form of oil. And you're going to have cars. Powered by horses? No. You could draw them a picture and say, this thing is going to go vroom, vroom, and they would just look at you like this. So it's going to make bird sounds, and you'd be like, oh, you're not getting this at all, are you? Okay. It would be the longest, toughest discussion you ever had. And then when you're done, they'd look at you and go, sure, that's what the future has. They'd pat you on the head. Crazy boy. Why don't you go on out of here? Just go ahead and don't ever come back. All right, we're going to end this here. We'll be back for part 6. Until then, have a good day. Have a good night.